Chapter 12. Out of Bainland. They made it to the stables easily, as no one had thought to guard them, and then quickly through the hidden door, which Tomaz simply threw a shoulder into, and it crumpled inward. From there they made it to the top of the black wall, and then began to descend the other side. The prince was so tired, though, and the places on his wrists where he had fought his bonds so chafed and sore, that when he was still a good 10 yards above the rooftop, his hands gave out. Luckily, Tomaz had gone down first, and the big man caught him before he tumbled to his death. Once they made it to the ground level, things became easier. The guards inside the walls had been alerted, but the outer city was still mostly silent. As the prince had predicted, everyone had gone to the main gates, and the seeker's path had remained unguarded. As they passed through the city, they picked out a few pairs of clean commons clothing, drying on tightly stretched bits of thin rope the exiles called clotheslines. The prince, very gratefully, shed his filthy clothing, even his undergarments, and changed them all for fresh cotton replicas. To his surprise, he was quite excited to pull on the new commons pants and shirt. They certainly weren't his prince robes, but they were comfortable and provided good mobility, which would help with the escape. "Princeling," Tomaz rumbled. He turned and saw that the big man was holding up a hammer he'd found in an equipment rack. The big man motioned for him to approach, and the prince did. Tomaz held the prince's hands over a low stone wall and then deftly swung the hammer once, twice, thrice. There was a loud clatter of metal, and then the shackles fell away, and the prince was free. For a long moment they all stood, frozen, waiting to see if anyone had heard the noise. But when no alarm was raised, a hand tapped the prince on the shoulder, and he turned to see the girl holding up the smaller of the water skins and a tiny cake of Tomaz's soap. "Wash those cuts." "No, I'm fine." "Do it," the girl insisted. "We can do it when we're safe away from here," he insisted back, feeling that she was being unreasonable. "We can do it now," she said, eyeing him dangerously, "when we don't have Imperials right on top of us. I'm not saving you just so you die in a week from infection. We'll have time later. Just wash the cuts." "Make me," the prince retorted. "Make you? Are you 7? Just wash them." "No." The girl seized the water skin, but the prince refused to let go, and the result was that they ended up nose to nose, glaring at each other again. "Save the bickering for later," Tomaz rumbled. "We're escaping right now." A beat passed, and then both of them dropped the skin, which the big man caught and tied to his waist. Tomaz turned and vaulted over the wall that surrounded the garden. The prince and the exile girl followed close behind, very pointedly, not looking at each other. They made their way through the outer city and circled around to the Rourke Road, heading south. The haphazard, run-down back streets of the outer city turned once more to wide, smooth paving stones, and their pace picked up. Soon they were past the last houses and shops and crossing the large, grassy area that surrounded the city. A wind sprang up behind them and brought sounds of pursuit, but they were far away now, and the cries were fading as they left the city. The road began to twist and turn, making its way through a series of small hills. They were all panting for breath now, and the prince felt as though his heart might give out from sheer exhaustion. But somehow he found the energy to carry on until they'd gotten far enough away and left the road altogether. Tomaz and the exile girl slowed, and the prince gratefully followed suit. They headed toward a series of larger hills covered in trees. Pine trees. The smell cast the prince's mind back to their journey through the Elmist Mountains. That journey had been defined by his need to escape from the same exiles who were now his one chance of survival. If he had been more rested, he might have better appreciated the irony. They stopped on a grassy hillside at the tree line of a forest from which they could just see Bainland. They stood there for a moment, catching their breath, the prince barely able to stand. Tomaz disappeared off into the forest, and the prince took one step to follow, but almost fell to the ground. He wished they still had the packhorse, even if he had to be tied onto it again. As if in answer to his prayers, Tomaz emerged from the wooded glen, leading the very same packhorse the prince had stolen and taken into the city. How? He asked weakly. "While she was following you, I was following the horse," Tomaz said. "Trudger's a good horse. Wouldn't want to lose him." "Trudger," the prince said. "I didn't... It has a name." Tomaz smiled slightly. "He does." The prince thought about what the giant had said for a moment, about the girl following him. Abruptly he turned to her and saw her staring out at the distant city. I don't know your name," he said bluntly. The fact that he was still trying to catch his breath made him more curt than he'd intended. The girl turned and raised an eyebrow. He looked at her for a moment, then swallowed, took a deep breath, and spoke again. "Would you please tell me your name? I would like to know it." "I've heard that question before somewhere," she said dryly, "though I vaguely remember being the one to ask it." The prince nodded, and then, on sudden impulse, he took a step forward, drawing the dagger she'd lent him. She tensed, but he ignored that. She had every right to be wary of him. For that matter, she had every right to hit him upside the head and leave him unconscious to meet his fate, the way he'd done to her. But he didn't strike her with the dagger, as she must have feared. Instead, he turned it over and offered it to her. "I apologize for the way I acted." Part of him was watching what he was doing in disbelief, but the larger part of him felt that this was right. She had saved his life, even though he had given her no reason to. There was honor in this, and justice in a way that was separate from the laws of the Empire. This was something between the two of them. This was a debt he had to repay, and this was the least he could do to fulfill that obligation. "Thank you for lending this to me," he continued, holding the dagger out in both hands. "And thank you for coming for me of your own free will." He turned and nodded to Tamaz. "Both of you, of course." Tamaz nodded and smiled. The prince turned back to the girl and watched her, wondering what her reaction would be. She stared at the dagger and then looked up into his face. "I don't either," she said. Given that this response didn't seem to make sense, the prince suddenly wondered if she had been hit on the head during their escape. "Don't what?" he asked. "Don't kill people, unless I have to," she said quietly, piercing him with her green eyes. The prince drew a sharp breath as he remembered her reaction to him when he had said that. He opened his mouth to respond, but then shut it. He didn't know what to say, and so, as Tamaz had once recommended, he would say nothing at all. "We need to move," Tamaz rumbled. The girl broke her gaze away from his and nodded to Tamaz. She paused, then spoke again to the prince. "Keep the dagger. You might still need it. We aren't out of this yet." She walked away, and the prince realized that she wouldn't answer his original question and tell him her name. He didn't know why, but the realization hurt, and it made his heart sink. It was understandable, though. He was probably the last person she wanted in her debt, and why would she trust him with her name? He had betrayed her. He slid the dagger into the belt of his borrowed clothing and looked out at the city again, trying to hide his disappointment. "Leah," she said. He froze, then quickly turned back around. She was still facing away from him, her back tensed in a way that told him the answer had slipped out through clenched teeth. "My name is Leah Goldwyn." He swallowed to work moisture into his mouth. "Thank you, Leah Goldwyn, for saving my life. I am in your debt." When he fell silent, she walked away, over to the horse. The prince turned to Tamaz. "And I thank you too, Tamaz. I am in your debt as well. Thrice over, it would appear." Tamaz inclined his head solemnly, accepting the prince's thanks. The big man's eyes followed him as he turned once more to look at the city. "You were telling the truth," the prince said blankly, "and this time there can be no doubt. The seeker told me, before he locked me away, told me everything about the assassination, about what my—" He fell silent. But what he had meant to say hung in the air, whole and complete even though he hadn't finished it. About what my mother had commanded. He felt more than saw the exiles exchange a glance. After a moment of tension, Leah cleared her throat noisily. "Come on," she said, the barest hint of softness creeping into her voice. She cleared her throat again, roughly this time, and the softness was gone. "We won't be alone for long. Word will get out soon and we'll be followed. No doubt they're still investigating the inner city, assuming we could get past the gates, but eventually they'll realize we escaped. Or that seeker will wake up and put the pieces together for them. I think we can anticipate scouting parties within the hour, though I don't think they'll range very far from the city initially. We need to get far away from Bainland, get around the western side of Lake Chartaine, and disappear into the wilderness for a bit. They never patrol alone. There's always 3 groups that—" It was Tamaz who cleared his throat this time, and she broke off, pink spots of emotion appearing on her cheeks as if she realized she'd been rambling. The prince understood, though. She was uneasy, and coping by talking too much about things that didn't need to be discussed. "We'll leave once we've caught our breath," the big man said. Leah began to move off, but suddenly went down on one knee with a low moan of pain. The prince moved toward her in alarm, but it was Tomaz who reached her first. He calmly picked her up and brought her back into the center of the tangled den of trees with a look of fond concern. "What happened?" the prince asked. "Concerned for me, princeling?" The prince, despite the teasing tone of her voice, reached out through the raven talisman and felt for her life. Swirls of green and silver light, the sound of steel cutting silk, the silent second after a symphony ends, the smell of honey and newly trodden dust, new pain but manageable, grim laughter, quiet wonder. He pulled back. She was whole. Wounded, but whole. She was strong and would recover. There was a small patch of blood on the side of her common shirt. The big man noticed it at the same time the prince did. "Ribs?" Tomaz asked. "Just a slice," she said. "Probably good to do a stitch or two, though." "Then we'll do it now," he said, in a voice that brooked no argument. "We are far enough away to spend the next few hours here. They need to finish searching the city and the surrounding towns before they come for us. And if we're lucky, Trudy will send them north for a time." "Trudy?" the prince asked. "The Seekers aren't the only ones with spies," Tomaz said. "Fine, but only if the princeling washes those cuts on his wrists, and binds them too, tightly, and checks the older wounds, make sure they're healing." Fine, the prince said. "I agree." Mollified, Leah allowed Tomaz to lead them further into the woods. Soon they came upon a woven thicket created out of a large grove of trees and bushes that had grown together, creating a kind of living cave. The three of them managed to prod the horse, Trudger, through the briars, where they found the second horse, Tomaz's charger, already tied to a tree and cropping the grass. Tomaz quickly backtracked to cover their trail, and then they unrolled some blankets and collapsed on the hard ground. Tomaz went to his pack, moving quickly but with a calm assurance. He threw a second blanket to the prince as he pulled out a needle and thread and began a small fire to heat water. "Wash those cuts quickly, and then try to get some sleep," he said. "I'll wake you when it's time to move." The prince took the small cake of soap and the water skin and scrubbed his wrists before wrapping them in strips of cloth. He pulled up his shirt to check the wounds he'd received fighting the Death Watchmen and saw they were healing into fine, puckered lines. There was nothing he could do for his ankle, though the extra week of forced rest in the Seeker's dungeon had actually left it feeling almost as good as new. He dropped the soap and skin next to the saddlebags and curled up in the blanket at the base of a gnarled oak tree, just intending to sit and rest. But before he knew it, he fell into a dark, dreamless sleep. When he woke, he felt warm and comfortable, and there was a glowing heat pressing against the side of his body. Slowly, very slowly, he opened his eyes. Above him, firelight played off the webbed canopy of branches that made up their living cave. On his right was Tomaz, stoking a small, smokeless fire. He tried to rise, but his body ached, and he sat back down again. "Rest while you can, princeling," Tomaz said. "You've been asleep for barely an hour. We have time yet before we have to move, and we have a long journey ahead of us. Best to rest as much as possible." "Aren't we being pursued?" he asked. "Won't they be able to track us by the smoke?" Tomaz grinned and shook his head, and then held a finger to his lips. The prince fell silent and listened, and heard soft rain falling outside their small living cave. The canopy above them was so tightly woven that none of the water made it through to them, but ran off to either side. "Clouds rolled in while you slept, and the wind is blowing south. Besides, soon we will be followed in earnest no matter what we do, and it might be several more days before we can risk a fire. I thought it best to have a small one while we could." The prince sat for a moment, wrapped in his blanket, and then with a sudden deliberateness managed to stand. Tomaz watched him quizzically. Determinedly, the prince walked forward and sat down at the fire across from the big man. He heard Tomaz sigh. "So much hardness," he rumbled sadly. "So much effort to cover up your pain instead of letting it flow, as it is meant to." "I'm not in pain," the prince said firmly. He was proud his voice didn't shake. "You are in pain," Tomaz contradicted, with the same indescribable sadness in his voice. and that makes me frightened for you." "You do not need to be frightened for me," the prince said, his voice formal and stiff. "But your concern is noted, and I thank you." Tomaz stood and rounded the fire. The prince watched him out of his peripheral vision, as he was trained to do. Watch without giving the impression of watching, his sister Daisuna had always told him. The big man stopped next to the prince and lowered himself to the ground to sit next to him. The prince tensed, as if expecting a blow, and the move did not go unnoticed. "Too much hardness can kill you, princeling," the exile said. "Hardness does not kill you," the prince responded, reciting by rote what he had been told since birth. "Weakness is death. Feeling is death. Life happens to you, and you cannot change what has happened. You harden yourself, and eventually you feel nothing, and then you cannot be challenged. You cannot be defeated. You cannot—" His throat seized up, and he broke off. "You don't think it is hard to be weak?" Tomaz asked. The prince opened his mouth to respond, but shut it again with a snap. "You do not agree that it is difficult to be weak? It was difficult for me to learn to be weak. That much I can tell you." The man was a small mountain. He, weak? The idea was laughable. "You are not weak," the prince said. "Don't think I can be caught off guard by simple lies." He realized he was being surly and curt for no reason, that his good humor of barely an hour ago had disappeared. Why was he acting this way? "What need have I to lie to you?" Tomaz asked. "Because you're an exile," the prince snapped back, rising to his feet. "You've rebelled against your true rulers. You've sworn to overthrow the very empire that provides safety and stability to the common man. You're a criminal. Criminals lie." The prince moved swiftly to the opposite side of the fire and looked out into the thicket of trees, not wanting to see the exile. "A criminal who has saved your life," Tomaz said. A chill ran up the prince's back. What was the giant trying to say? Was he trying to blackmail the prince? With a surge of adrenaline, he spun and looked down at the big man, still seated by the fire, and drew himself up to his full height, expecting Tomaz to be sitting there with a sinister smile, waiting to capitalize on his debt. But what the prince saw was a bluff, honest, kind man, and it completely deflated his anger and righteousness. Suddenly his vision was hazy, and he had to look down at the ground. His siblings had never come to his rescue, even once. Tomaz had saved him 3 times now, once even nursed him back to health in the middle of the empire where he was a wanted man. Help is a sign of weakness, weakness a sign of unworthiness. Mother would never have— His mind blanked out before he could finish the treasonous thought. He began to count the leaves under his feet and narrowed his hearing in on the cracking and popping sounds of the fire, unable to face his thoughts and so seeking mercy in the simplicity of sensation. "You are not weak because you need help. You are not weak because you are grateful," Tomaz said. The prince shrugged his shoulders as if he could throw off the voice like it were an irritating fly. "I know I am not weak," he said. "You are not listening to me," the big voice said. "You are not weak because you need help. You are not weak because you are grateful." "You already said that. I know this. I've already acknowledged my debt to you." But the prince couldn't look Tomaz in the face. He continued to stare at the ground, trying to count leaves, trying to calm his mind, trying to stop himself from thinking and feeling. "Of course," Tomaz said, "but you are not weak because you need help. You are not weak because you are grateful." The prince coughed to clear his throat. An arm wrapped around his shoulders. "There you go," the big man said. "There you go." And then the prince was crying. Tears ran down his face, and silent sobs racked his body. His forehead was buried in the big man's enormous chest, and hands bigger than the prince's head were patting him gently on the back, ruffling his hair with calm affection. "I tried so hard," he choked out, the words coming through a throat almost closed up with the emotion he had tried so hard to contain. "I did what they expected of me. At least I tried, but they didn't want me." He could say no more, and he broke down into sobs that shook his entire body. He clung to Tomas as he had never been allowed to cling to another human being in his life, as he had never let himself cling to another human being. "I know," was all Tomas said over and over again. "I know. I know." He didn't know how long they stood there, at the edge of the fire, but eventually he became aware of the quiet in the air around them, punctured only by the pattering sound of falling rain. Suddenly he felt suffocated by the big man's nearness and pushed away from him. He walked around the fire, trying to put something between the two of them, but he felt the giant watching him, and so once he had gained the safety of space, he turned back. Tomas was watching him with a strange look, as if something he hadn't anticipated had just taken place, something that had rekindled a fire in his small black eyes. "Why don't you take a name?" he rumbled. The prince immediately felt himself close back up again, tensing, shutting down. He looked away with a sharp twist of his head, and when he looked back, Tomas was staring into the fire, as if it had only been a friendly question. He seemed just as interested in following the shifting, changing flames as he did the prince's answer. As the silence lengthened, Tomas looked back up politely. Chips of dark, black stone, not eyes. But there was light in them, a light that was greater than the reflection of the fire. "I have no name," the prince said finally. He was surprised to find that the pride was gone from the statement. There was no defiance in it now. It was simply a fact. He supposed Tomas would have seen through it if he had said anything else. "You sound sad," the big man replied bluntly. "I have no name," the prince repeated wryly. It felt strange to talk about it. Why had Tomas brought it up? Was he trying to convince the prince of something? "Neither did I," said Tomas, "when I left the fortress." It took the prince a few seconds to realize what he'd just heard. What? Tomas, still staring calmly into the fire, reached up and slowly undid his cloak, removed his shirt, and then the ties holding on his breastplate. He laid it all gently to the side, and then he removed his leather jerkin, and finally a close-fit, woven tunic to leave himself bare-chested. He rose, his enormous muscles rippling in the firelight, and turned his back on the prince. Involuntarily, the prince recoiled and drew in a sharp breath. Spreading across Tomas's shoulders and back was an enormous 7-pointed star, tattooed in blue and white ink with sparkling diamond flecks that shimmered and shone in the reflected light of the fire. It was the sign of a blade master, the most elite force of fortress guardians. Guardians were never seen outside the fortress unless they were in the presence of the children, and blade masters were rarely ever seen outside the company of the Empress herself, unless it was for a mission of utmost importance that could be entrusted to no one else. How? The prince managed to get out. It was the last thing he had expected to find, the most glorious and feared symbol of the Empire's power, here among the trees and wilderness, so far from the fortress. It left his mind reeling. "I left the fortress nearly 20 years ago now, give or take a few," the exile said. He began to pull his tunic back over his head, calmly and with his customary assurance of movement. The same flowing movement the prince had seen all of his life among the guardians of the fortress. How had he so easily dismissed it before? "I had been a member of the guard for 5 years before I was given a summons to enter the presence of the Empress herself." 5 years, thought the prince in amazement. It was unheard of for a guardian to be summoned that soon. There were precious few who were summoned before they had served 10 years, maybe even 15. "When I came into the throne room, my superiors were there, and every blade master then living. I was invited forward, told to kneel before the Empress by her hand, and then she laid a single finger on my forehead." He seated himself again by the fire, once more fully dressed. "I was told later that what she did was called delving, that she was examining me for the qualities of a blade master. All I remember was her nodding, and then I was given over to the blade masters themselves, who took me and tested me. 7 days of testing." The big man paused, and a grimace passed over his face. The prince couldn't imagine what had been terrible enough of a test to make him cringe like that at the memory, but he had heard rumors and knew that not all potential blade masters survived to serve. "I passed," though I felt at the time that I would rather have failed. It would have been less painful. My first assignment came soon after. I was the star pupil of the elder masters, and they gave the assignment to me to prove myself in the eyes of the Empress. He paused for a moment, and his face darkened. The assignment was an assassination of a man living in Lucien not too far outside the fortress. Assassination? Why would they give that to a guardian? Assassinations were carried out by the Death Watchmen, and as far as the prince knew, by them alone. As you'd guess, I was surprised, but as I was then, I did not question it. If the Empress and my fellow Blade Masters believed the assignment important, then it was important. I was told that it was a matter of security for the fortress, that this man had uncovered secrets that were dangerous to the Empire, and that the man himself was too dangerous for even the Death Watch to deal with. I did my job too well. I killed the man before he even knew I was there. Perhaps if I had let him speak, I would have realized my error sooner and prevented a tragedy. For weeks, something did not sit right with me. I was short-tempered. I became angry at the servants. I felt uneasy about my actions. So, using my newly acquired rank as Blade Master, I went and discovered the truth of the man's crime. Pain and harshness entered his voice. It was no crime. Not at all. Not to me, at least. He gazed out over the fire into the memory of that day, reliving it there by the fireside. Deep lines of sorrow and regret settled over his face, and the prince saw then the Blade Master that Tomaz had been, saw it in his empty stare and his loss of laughter. I had sworn to protect the safety of the Empress, and through her the Empire and the stability of the Diamond Throne. I was perfectly suited to the role of a guardian, and what was more, unlike many, I was convinced of the rightness of the cause, the justice. He turned to look at the prince. I was wrong. It was not justice that I performed, but injustice. The things I have seen, the things I have had explained to me, that the Empress and the children have done, that the Empire allows to happen. Words seemed to fail him, and the pain turned to anger. He took a breath and began again a different way. When I left the fortress, I was detected and followed. I killed the men following me, and soon I was pursued by those who had once been my sworn brothers. For weeks I fought my way across the Empire, running and hiding, only fighting when I needed to. In the end, I was found nearly dead by the exiled kindred. They took me in, hid me from the Empire. I didn't join them at first. I was too blinded by my old prejudices. But soon I saw that what the Empire had claimed to be, the kindred actually were. They kept me safe from the Order, which to this day maintains that I am dead, that I must be, for they failed to find me in the end. My name was taken from me during the flight. The Empress renounced me, and it was then that I almost gave up and lost hope. I still cannot remember myself as that person, for as you know, once a name is taken, no one can remember it, much less say it. But in the end, once enough time had passed, I took a new name, one that I chose for myself. I chose a new name and I chose a new path, not one that I was selected for, but one that I selected for myself. His gaze turned to the prince. You are freed from the children and the Empress. It is your choice what to do now. Your choice, and yours alone. It was a long time before the prince spoke. You speak as if I am no longer one of the children. I do, was the response. Simple as it was, it spoke volumes. They are my family, he said. Your family, Tomaz responded, in name and blood alone. They have severed their ties with you regardless of your wishes. And now you are free to choose your own life, to choose your own family, to choose who and what you wish to be. The prince remained silent for a long moment, and then seated himself by the fireside next to Leah's sleeping form. Her words came back to him. Not with this curse around my neck, he said quietly, fingering the black marks over his shoulders through the cotton of his shirt. It is only a curse if you believe it to be, the big man rumbled. He rose to his feet, circled the fire, and draped one of the extra blankets over the prince's shoulders. The ex-blade master's rough hands were surprisingly gentle. Now, sleep, he said. We have a long day ahead of us. Several days. I will wake you when we need to leave. I thought you said I was free to make my own choices, the prince said. Tamaz smiled wryly. Only when I say you can. The prince sat staring into the fire for a time, his mind turning over the conversation and the exile's story, as Tamaz settled himself once more. Free, he whispered to himself. His mind returned to his daydreams in the fortress, where he had imagined what it would be like to go to the places where the sun shone and the wind blew, where things were green and water flowed in rivers. Free, he said again, tasting the word as he said it, trying to understand how it felt in his mouth, how it felt to say it, the implications. The prince looked over at Tamaz. I have no chosen path, no way forward. It's terrifying. Yes, freedom always is